Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the 10-Minute Bible Lesson. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've been watching our videos, you know we've been in the book of Judges, and we've been studying about the judges that God raised up. Think about that just a minute, that God would select somebody because He could see that His children were being oppressed, and He would pick somebody, the right person, and He would raise him up to be a deliverer. I delivered the people from the other tribes, the other nations that were oppressing them. And to me, in some ways, the whole thing seems a little strange to me, and let me just explain what I mean. So you have generation, it seems like after generation, that kept repeating the same eras in their life. And I think that's really sad. To me, it kind of tells me about the way we are as human beings, and that it just seems like we keep repeating the same mistakes. And that's what the children of Israel did. And they would rebel, against God. And then the thing that God really didn't like is that they would start worshiping the gods of the nations around them. In other words, they were worshiping idols, and I can't help but think that it must have hurt God in His heart because of all of the things that God had done for them, and yet they did that. So it's kind of like one of the big main themes in the Old Testament. It's like one of the biggest things I think that God got angry with is that they worshiped idols. Now, you and I, we don't think of ourselves as worshiping idols, do we? I don't think we. I mean, you don't have any little carved images of that represent some god. You don't keep those around your house and bow down to them and pray to them. I mean, I'm thinking I don't do that, and you don't do that. I mean. So since it was such a great big thing in the Old Testament and we don't really seem to have that, I guess a question I wanted to ask is that, what do you think about this? Do you think that if a person puts something in their life that is more important to them than God is? I wanted to ask you, do you think that they would be making that in a way that would be their idol? It would be something that they have elevated above their devotion to God. Well, you can think about that. I was just wondering if that was true. So what God would do when they would rebel against Him is that He would withdraw His protection and withdraw His favor from them. And then when that happened, they began to suffer. And listen, they'd suffer greatly. And then after they got the suffering, it would cause them to humble themselves. And then God would raise up a deliverer. Now, at this time, the Midianites were oppressing them and the Amalekites. Let me read just a little bit about it in Judges chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. It says, "For they would come up with their livestock and their tents." Sounds like they were just moving in. "Coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number. And they would enter the land to destroy it." So Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. And God chose Gideon. I don't know if you remember last time we began to talk about Gideon, who would be the one to save Israel. Now Gideon said to the Lord, he said, "How can I do this? How can I save Israel?" And I got to thinking about it. You could look at that in two ways. You could say to Gideon, "Hey, Gideon, you need to step up." Or you could think of Gideon in the sense that he didn't feel like he was able to do that. And I think sometimes that's not a bad thing. Because I believe that God, He doesn't use people that feel like, "Hey, listen, I've got this. I can take care of this." What I mean is, I don't believe God uses people that are full of themselves and full of the confidence that they have in themselves. And Gideon was not like that. In fact, Gideon told God, he said, "My clan," his clan in the tribe of Manasseh, he said, "My clan is the weakest clan." And he said this, and he said, in my family, he said, I'm the weakest one in my family. He said, I'm the weakest one in my father's house. And so that's kind of how he thought about it. But you know what God does? You probably know this. I think God uses people that are weak. Now, why would God do that? I think God does that so that He'll get the glory for it, because actually it's God that's doing it. And a person that's weak, he realizes, I couldn't do this on myself, so he has to say, you know, God did this. So I think that's really, really important. So how in the world would Gideon be able to defeat this army? Well, he would do that because God said He would help him. And I think that's the important thing. So the first thing that Gideon did, and I really admire this about Gideon, the Bible says the first thing that he did, one of the first things that he did was he worshiped God. Now, how did he worship God? He built an altar to the Lord and made a sacrifice to God. It was almost like, you know what, I'm going to get myself straightened out. I'm going to get my relationship with the Lord. I've got this thing that God's called me to. I want to make sure that I'm right with the Lord. And you know what God told him? God says, Gideon, I want you to tear down that idol to Baal. You tear down the altar that they have built to Baal. And you know, Gideon was a little bit afraid to do this. And he took some men, and at night he went and tore down that altar to Baal. And when the men of the town woke up and saw that idol was tore down, they wanted to know who did it. And they found out that it was Gideon, and you know what? They were going to kill Gideon. But you know, Gideon's dad, Joaz, stood up and he said this. He says, are you going to speak for Baal? Are you going to be the one who defends Baal? He said, I think Baal can speak for himself if he's a god. That's what Gideon's father said. And he said, no, the person who stands up and stands up for Baal, let him be the one that dies. And that incident, what happened is they began to call Gideon another name. They called him Jerubbaal. And so I just thought that was interesting. So when the Midianites and the Amalekites were encamped in the valley of Jezreel, this is what happened. This is what God did. And this is in Judges 6 as well, but it's in verse 34. It says, but the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. Now Gideon, he also sent messengers throughout his whole tribe, and that was to the tribe of Manasseh. But he also sent messengers to Asher and to Zebulun and to Naphtali. Those were other tribes, and they all came. So all of this is kind of taking place, but Gideon is still lacking confidence because he's a weak guy in some ways. And so he wants, he wants more assurance from the Lord. What do you think Gideon did? Or what would you do if you had this big task and you weren't real sure and you didn't have quite enough confidence to step out in faith? What would you do? Well, here's what Gideon did. He asked God to show him a sign. And let's read about it, and that's in Judges chapter 6, verses 36 and 37. So Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. I thought that was interesting that Gideon says, if you'll just show me a sign, and this is the sign, he said, if you show me that sign, he says, I will know that you're going to do just exactly what you said you were going to do. And so I'm sure you think that's what happened to Gideon, right? God did that. And so he got up the next morning, he got the fleece. He noticed all around the threshing floor it was all dry, and he picked up the fleece and he wrung out a bowl full of water. So I'm sure this just made Gideon have so much confidence. He was ready to go, right? No. He was not ready to go. In fact, the Bible says this in verse 39, verse 6, listen to this. Then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. I've got to make sure about this fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on all the ground let there be dew. And so, you'd think God would really be losing patience with him, but you know what? God did what he asked. He got up the next morning and grabbed that fleece, and he picked it up, and that thing was just as dry as it could possibly be. And he looked around, and all around him there was dew everywhere. I don't know. What do you think about Gideon? I was just wondering. Do you think that he lacked faith or lacked confidence, or would you be like that? Do you think it's a good idea to what someone might say to put a fleece out? I'm not so sure. I think we just need to trust God and step out, but a lot of times we have to have God kind of do something special for us, especially if it's something big. Well, listen, we've got another lesson we're going to cover about Gideon, but we're going to have to stop today right here, and we'll pick it up next time, and we'll find out what God does and how God uses Gideon to deliver his people from the Midianites and the Amalekites. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hope you have a really good week.